All right.
Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be refuting the claim that animal testing in the United States has the greatest protections for animals used in research. I want to start off this by mentioning the fact that in this claim that the person had, they do use an absolute in their claim, claiming that the U.S. has the greatest protections for animals does make it susceptible for any contradictions or exceptions. Furthermore, in the speech itself, there are no attempts to show any other countries and their methods of protections for animals, therefore making it hard to gauge whether or not the U.S. has, quote, the greatest protections. My refutation claim is that the speaker's lack of evidence, sources, and overall reasoning delegitimizes their case that animal testing in the U.S. has the greatest protections. So their first secondary claim is that animal testing allows or follows various regulations and is strictly monitored by the government. In the speech, this person does list a lot of different organizations and policies that are aimed towards protecting the well-being of animals. However, the speaker does not dive deeper into the actual details of the acts, nor do they go into the actual effects, the actual statistical effects that it has had. I have done some research upon the actual acts that were mentioned in the speech. For example, the 3 R's of reduction, replacement, and refinement are actual guidelines that many scientists do acknowledge and follow. However, there is a great deal of ambiguity between which types of protections are enough, quote, enough. Some researchers can interpret the facts or the terms differently, leading to more unethical methods of research compared to others. And in fact, the Animal Welfare Act, which is one of the acts mentioned, while it does include protections for most animals, it does not include protections for animals such as mice and rats, which are the most widely used animals in research settings. A provision in 2002 to include these animals was struck down by the U.S. Congress. And in fact, according to a study funded by the National Institute of Health, the amount of animals, particularly among rats and mice, has actually increased in the last 15 years, statistically by 73%. Their secondary claim number 2 is that numerous organizations cause companies to be cruelty-free. Again, there are no sources or explanations as to how these methods are followed. And furthermore, the presenter touches upon the fact that cruelty-free products have no set definition in the United States by the FDA. The grounds presented in this claim actually contradict the claim that she has that the U.S. has the greatest protections for animals. The ambiguity within the federal standard contradicts the argument that the U.S. government has regulations in place to protect animals in her first claim. In addition, the speaker also commits a fallacy of composition, judging from her experience within her research at a previous university. The lack of set guidelines earlier in the speech also hurts the argument because we cannot logically assume that the standards that her school followed meet the aforementioned guidelines to base her experience of. So this case doesn't necessarily meet the test of inductive reasoning because we have nothing to compare her school's practices to any other practices that would be termed as great or legitimate by the federal government as well as other researchers. The last claim that the arguer makes is that numerous professional careers are dedicated to the well-being of animals. The speaker touches upon how veterinarians, registered vet techs are careers that many people pursue in order to take care of the well-being of animals. However, this point has no relevance to the idea of great care for animals in the use of a research setting, which is the main claim that the arguer is presenting. In addition, there is no information regarding how the American Association for Laboratory Animal Sciences has certain rigorous tests or practices that adhere to the guidelines that she mentions earlier, once again, that do not have any explanation as to how they are practiced or followed in the beginning. So in conclusion, because the speaker fails to acknowledge any type of evidence, sources, or overall reasoning to connect the evidence that she has, it delegitimizes her case towards the claim that animal testing in the United States has the greatest protections for animals used in research.
All right, well, I was a little worried that you were going to go off on a tangent with that greatest criteria, you know, the lack of any modification, and it didn't turn out to be that was a big issue. I don't think that that's really what the advocate's point was, and I thought that you did end up sticking mostly to the point that the advocate was talking about, whether or not there are sufficient protections or whether or not the protections that we have are good or adequate. Maybe that's a better way of explaining it. On the first point, you suggest that there's an absence of specificity for the sources and the rules that are being talked about. I seem to recall that the advocate cited a number of rules and procedures under the Animal Welfare Act, and that there might in fact have been some other organizations or groups that were mentioned. So if that is the case, you know, and my memory is not what it could be, then I think that you may have missed an opportunity to respond to that. The criticism or the you know, the way you kind of diminish the question of the 3 R's is to suggest, yeah, but who's to define what this is? There's ambiguity in this. And I'm willing to concede that there's ambiguity here, but does that ambiguity undermine the notion that that is, in fact, the general goal, and in fact, it should minimize the impact on animals that is unnecessary? I don't know that your argument gives me any reason to believe that. The one piece of evidence that you have in your argument well, actually you've got 2 pieces of evidence so that they come back to back, is that rats and mice are mostly excluded from the AWA. That's a piece of factual data, and that Congress wouldn't pass a restriction on that, and that that there's been an increased use in the rats and mice. I'm not sure if you're implying that the increased use of rats and mice is because other animals are used less, or if it has some other issue that we're dealing with. You know, when we talk about the question of protecting animals, we're getting into an area here that is potentially a value-based issue. And so I'm hesitant to suggest that your argument is irrelevant, because I don't think it is irrelevant, but the question that the advocate made and the question that you're talking about, I'm not sure that we can resolve it by some objective means here. The cruelty-free argument, I wasn't quite sure I understood it when it was presented by the advocate. I'm not sure I understand it after you've presented it. The notion that there's no set definition of cruelty-free, and that it kind of contradicts or creates some ambiguity in the situation. So in the long run, because somebody is able to advertise their product as cruelty-free, does that create a false impression that there is cruelty? Or does that mean that we actually have reduced cruelty? Or is it a false belief that we've reduced cruelty? I don't know. And I don't know why this argument was developed by the advocate particularly, and I don't know why it's being answered in this particular manner. In the long run, it just feels like we're getting a runaround on the language here instead of an explanation about why the claim matters. The argument about whether or not her experience is something that we can generalize from, that's a reasonable press on inductive reasoning. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But again, it would be helpful if you had some data that suggested that in fact people are not always adhering to the rules and laws. I think that should be something that you wouldn't have a hard time finding, and that would maybe make your argument a little bit more substantive instead of sounding like it's a lot of the presses that I've mentioned to a couple of other speakers. You know, reasonable kinds of challenges to the reasoning and to the evidence that somebody is presenting, but not very strong rebuttal argument and not information. You know, the grounds of your argument, I think, are a little suspect. You're depending upon, you know, premises which, you know, may or may not be true. It would be stronger if they were true. All right. We're going to stop there. You guys have a good evening. I will see you 5 days from now.
45 to 8? Yeah, I guess so.